It is 1389, Florence, Italy. A cloth merchant named Giovanni di Bicci de Medici opens a small money-changing shop near the Ponte Vecchio. He has no title, no army, no royal blood. Within 3 generations, his family will control the finances of the Pope himself. They will build churches, commission paintings, and reshape Western civilization. They will place 2 women on the throne of France. They will produce 4 popes. And then they will go bankrupt. How does a family of cloth merchants become the most powerful dynasty in Europe? And what does it tell us about the relationship between money, power, and legacy that the same bank that paid for Michelangelo's David ultimately collapsed because its final leader cared more about art than accounting? This is the story of the Medici Bank, and it begins in the filthiest, most profitable industry of the medieval world, lending money to the church. To understand the Medici, you have to understand Florence. By the 14th century, Florence was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. Not because of conquest, not because of empire, but because of cloth. Florentine wool merchants had mastered the trade routes from England to the Levant. They imported raw English wool, processed it into fine fabric, and sold it across the Mediterranean at enormous profit. But cloth was only part of the story. The real money was in what the cloth merchants did with their profits. They became bankers. Medieval Europe had a problem. The church banned usury, the lending of money at interest. It was a sin, a mortal sin. You could go to hell for charging interest, but kings needed to fund wars. Merchants needed credit for long-distance trade, and the Pope himself needed a bank to collect taxes from every diocese in Christendom. Florence's merchant bankers found a solution so elegant it would define finance for centuries. They called it the lettera di cambio, the bill of exchange. Instead of charging interest directly, they disguised it as a currency conversion fee. You give me 1,000 florins in Florence, I give you a slightly smaller amount in London, expressed in a different currency at an exchange rate I control. The difference? That's my profit. That's not usury. That's just a service. The church looked the other way. The bankers got rich, and the Medici were about to become the best of them. Giovanni di Bicci de Medici was not born into wealth. He was the youngest son of a modest Florentine family. When his father died young, an older cousin, a successful banker in Rome, took him in as an apprentice. It was in Rome that Giovanni learned the most important lesson in medieval finance. The most reliable client in the world was not a king. It was not a merchant. It was the Pope. The Catholic Church in the 14th century was, functionally, a multinational corporation. It had income from dioceses, monasteries, and parishes across every Christian kingdom in Europe. It needed a bank to collect that income, transfer it to Rome, and manage it efficiently. The previous papal bankers, the Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence, had learned this lesson the hard way. They had grown rich on church deposits, and then they had committed the fatal error of lending those deposits to Edward III of England to fund the 100 Years' War. Edward defaulted. Both banks collapsed in 1345 in one of the worst banking crashes of the medieval world. Giovanni watched, and he learned. In 1397, Giovanni did something unusual for an ambitious banker. He moved the main branch of the Medici Bank not to Venice, the commercial capital, but to Rome, specifically to be close to the Vatican. His strategy was simple: win the papal account, be indispensable to God. It worked. Within a decade, the Medici Bank held the account of the Apostolic Chamber, the Vatican's treasury. Every time a new bishop was appointed anywhere in Europe, he paid a fee to the Pope. That fee flowed through the Medici Bank. Every crusade tax, every tithe collection, every papal financial transaction in Christendom. The Medici didn't just have a client, they had a monopoly. And Giovanni used this position with careful, almost surgical discipline. He expanded the bank branch by branch: Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London. Each branch was structured not as a department of the Medici Bank, but as a separate legal entity with local partners who had their own stake in its success. This holding company structure, revolutionary for its time, insulated the parent firm from the failure of any single branch. If London defaulted, Rome survived. If Venice had a bad year, Florence carried on. It was essentially the first modern financial conglomerate. When Giovanni de Bicci died in 1429, he left his eldest son Cosimo a profitable bank, a solid reputation, and one piece of advice: stay out of politics. Cosimo did not listen. Cosimo de Medici, known to history as Cosimo il Vecchio, Cosimo the Elder, is perhaps the most consequential person you've never heard of. He didn't write philosophy, he didn't paint, he didn't win battles, but he funded the people who did. And in doing so, he remade the world. When Cosimo took over the Medici Bank in 1429, it was already successful. When he died in 1464, it was the largest and most profitable bank in Europe. At its peak, the Medici Bank had branches in 7 cities, employed hundreds of people, and managed assets that would be worth billions in today's money. How? Cosimo was a better banker than his father in one critical respect. He understood leverage. The Medici Bank didn't just lend its own money, it used deposits, money placed with the bank by wealthy Florentine families, church officials, and European merchants. These depositors received a share of the bank's profits instead of interest, again, technically avoiding the sin of usury. This deposit base allowed the Medici Bank to lend out far more than it held in its own reserves. Sound familiar? It should. This is fractional reserve banking, the same principle that underpins every commercial bank in the world today. Cosimo also expanded the bank's services. Letters of credit allowed merchants to travel without carrying gold. Insurance-like instruments reduced the risk of maritime trade. Foreign exchange arbitrage, buying currency where it was cheap and selling where it was expensive, generated profit from nothing but information and timing. The Medici Bank was not just a bank. It was a financial services company, 6 centuries before that phrase existed. But Cosimo used his wealth in a way that no banker before or since has quite replicated. He became a patron of the arts, not as a hobby, but as a political strategy. Florence was a republic, technically, but it was a republic run by wealthy merchant families who competed for influence. Cosimo understood that military power was expensive and temporary. Cultural power was cheap and eternal. He commissioned the architect Filippo Brunelleschi to build the dome of Florence Cathedral, the largest dome constructed since the Pantheon in ancient Rome, the dome that still defines Florence's skyline today. He funded the sculptor Donatello. He brought manuscripts of ancient Greek philosophy to Florence from Byzantium. He founded the Platonic Academy, essentially the first humanities think tank of the modern era. He built churches. He restored monasteries. He gave so much to the church that the Pope granted him the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. Every ducat he spent on art and architecture returned tenfold in political legitimacy. He ruled Florence for 30 years, never holding a formal title, never sitting on a throne, just a banker, just a patron. When Cosimo died in 1464, Florence wept. His grandson would receive far more than tears. Lorenzo de Medici inherited the bank at age 20. History would call him Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. He was magnificent. He was also, eventually, catastrophic for the bank his grandfather had built. Lorenzo de Medici was everything a Renaissance prince should be. He was a poet, a philosopher, a patron of Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and the young Michelangelo. He could recite Dante from memory and debate Plato with scholars. He was also a terrible banker, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he genuinely did not care about the bank the way his grandfather did. He cared about Florence, about legacy, about beauty. The bank was simply the instrument that paid for all of it. This distinction mattered more than it sounds. Cosimo had treated the bank as the primary thing and used art as a tool of political strategy. Lorenzo treated politics and culture as the primary things and used the bank as a tool to fund them. Under Lorenzo, the Medici Bank began to deteriorate. Branch managers, unsupervised and incentivized to grow deposits, made increasingly risky loans to the nobility of Europe. The London branch lent enormous sums to Edward IV of England to fund his military campaigns. Edward never repaid them. The London branch collapsed in 1478. The Bruges branch did the same with the Duke of Burgundy. Same result. Then came the Pazzi conspiracy. In 1478, a rival Florentine banking family, the Pazzi, backed by Pope Sixtus IV, attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during High Mass at Florence Cathedral. Giuliano was stabbed 19 times and killed. Lorenzo escaped with a sword wound to the neck. The aftermath consumed Lorenzo's attention for years. He was now not just a banker politician, but a man fighting for his life, his family, and his city. Finance became secondary to survival. Lorenzo died in 1492 at the age of 43. By that point, the Medici Bank had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. Several branches had closed. The remaining ones were thinly capitalized. 2 years after Lorenzo's death, his son Piero, the one history unkindly calls Piero the Unfortunate, made a catastrophic political misjudgment. When France invaded Italy, Piero surrendered Florence's fortresses without a fight. The city exploded. The Medici were expelled. The friar Girolamo Savonarola, a fanatical preacher who had been condemning Medici excess for years, declared Florence a republic under God. He organized the Bonfire of the Vanities, burning thousands of artworks, books, mirrors, and cosmetics in the Piazza della Signoria. The greatest patrons of art in history were expelled by a man who burned art. The Medici Bank, which had operated for nearly a century, closed its doors. It never reopened. The story doesn't end in 1494. The Medici returned to Florence in 1512. 2 members of the family became Pope, Leo X and Clement VII. 2 became Queen of France, Catherine de Medici and Marie de Medici. Catherine de Medici, in fact, is credited with bringing the fork to France, along with fashions, cooking techniques, and cultural refinements that shaped the French court for generations. Not bad for a family of cloth merchants. But here is what the Medici left behind that matters most, and why this story is about more than one Italian family. The Medici invented, or perfected, the holding company structure that protects modern corporations from subsidiary failures. They developed the use of letters of credit that enabled international trade without the movement of physical gold, the ancestor of every electronic transfer made today. They pioneered the use of fractional reserve banking, mobilizing deposits far beyond their own capital. They demonstrated for the first time in history that cultural investment is political investment, that a patron of the arts could achieve more lasting power than a general. And they showed what happens when the people running a bank stop caring primarily about the bank. The Medici wanted to be remembered. They spent the equivalent of billions commissioning art, buildings, and scholarship precisely so the world would not forget them. They got what they paid for. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo's work, was commissioned under a Medici pope. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence houses perhaps the greatest collection of Renaissance art in the world. The Platonic Academy they founded helped spark the intellectual revolution we call the Renaissance. But the bank that paid for all of this? Gone. Collapsed under bad loans and a distracted leader. It is a lesson that echoes through every financial crisis in history. Institutions are only as strong as the discipline of the people running them. Giovanni de Bicci understood that. Cosimo understood it. Lorenzo the Magnificent, magnificent in every way except the one that mattered most for the business, did not. The Medici bought God. They funded genius. They bankrolled the rebirth of Western civilization, and then they went bankrupt. If you want to know what the Dutch did next, how a group of Amsterdam merchants took everything the Medici invented and turned it into the world's first stock market, subscribe. That story is coming very soon. And if the Medici taught you something today, drop a comment. Tell me which part surprised you the most. I'll see you in the next one.